Hello to Sydney Testers Group. Thank you so much for having me be able to speak to you today. If you are seeing this, it means that there is an issue with my travel plans or the weather in the San Francisco Bay Area. We've had an issue with weather advisories and wind advisories and possible power outages. So due to that, I am recording this as a safety measure. So if you get a chance to see this, it means I could not be with you in person. If I am with you in person, you won't be seeing this, plain and simple. Having gone that far, I'm going to go ahead and share, and I'd like to start this presentation with you all. Give just a second. There we go. So again, my greetings to Sydney Testers. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Michael Larsen, and I am a content delivery lead and software testing consultant currently with Exelon Development. And Exelon Development also features the managing director, Matt Heuser. And Matt and I do a number of things together, two of which, one is that we are the hosts of the podcast, The Testing Show, and we bring that out to you every month. And in addition to that, also, we have recently, we have recently written a book called Software Testing Strategies. And as you'll see, that book is in the lower corner. It's also branded on each of these pages. This is not necessarily a sales pitch, but if you do decide to buy the book, we would greatly appreciate it. But what you are going to see does come from the book, and we want to make very clear about that from the outset. This talk is called The Puzzle Pieces of Good Testing, Insights from Software Testing Strategies by Matthew Heuser and Michael Larsen, delivered the first time, 5th of February, 2024. So one of the things that we want to go through here is we want to talk about software delivery and the associated risks that go with it. Okay. There are many delivery styles, and each of them have unique risks. You could have a waterfall project where you start everything from the beginning and cascade it on through each phase until you get it out the door. Especially if you're dealing with built-in software, or if you were developing software in an older style that required physical media to deliver, that would be very normal. Nowadays, of course, because of continuous delivery and software as a service and other methodologies of being able to deliver your software, it is less imperative that you have that waterfall sequence. You could do it in cycles. You can do it much quicker with a number of different capacities. But the point here is that whatever style of software delivery you do, you are going to find yourself in certain risk categories. And some examples of risk are simple bugs, performance issues, and security vulnerabilities. So what we want to do is we want to effectively assemble the various puzzle pieces and building blocks of what we feel are good testing. And I want to make clear here that test cases might be the lowest of our priorities. We'll explain why that is during the course of this talk. There's a lot of things that come together to help make for good testing, and the puzzle pieces that we consider important, again, test cases themselves are very low on that list. There's a lot of other things that we think are important to this. Also, you may not need to use every one of these examples. You may use some testing pieces. You may use one or two. You may use all of them. You may even use some that are not physically presented here. So part of what we want to do is we want to discuss beyond test cases. Like I just said, what are the things you can do to enhance testing value? And the areas we're going to cover are recipes, or what we like to say, how to do hard things; coverage, which is ensuring right things are tested; defects, what's the status of your software quality; our schedule, how do we prioritize the tests we need to do; Strategy, how do I identify risks and put things into priority? And then you're going to see this in a number of places during the course of this presentation, but we're also going to talk about dashboards. And a dashboard or an information radiator, same thing. The point is we want to communicate what we're learning. That's what that represents. All right. So let's first off talk about recipes. What do we mean when we say recipes? Instead of having to go through and write out a big, long list of steps for tests, an exact order thing you have to do. Some of you probably have been through that. I certainly have, where you've had to go out and you've had to write complex, long strategies of test cases with a lot of stuff that repeats. And then when it comes down to it and you say, who's actually accessed the database for test management? And almost nobody does, or very rarely, because we realize there's so much repetition in there that a lot of it is just a waste of time to have to keep writing it over and over and over again. But there are key pieces that you know you're always going to have to do. You're always going to have to power on the system. You're always going to have to load up your framework. You're always going to have to, if you have a cloud environment, you might have to run Terraform to make sure that it's up and running. You might have to unpack something from Docker. You might have to set up data in a database to effectively test. You might have to install your application. Those things are always going to be there. And based off of what you're doing, you use those to help you set up your recipes for what you're going to work with. Also, recipes oftentimes have what we call a flavor profile. If you've ever cooked and you understand how certain ingredients work together, if you understand the concept of aromatics, you understand that you can use any number of vegetables along with onions and cook that up as a base, and it works into anything. And if you adjust one for another, you can get a different flavor. And if you know that and you work from that, you don't necessarily have to put half an onion in and mix till brown, put something else in and mix till brown. You already know what those things are and how to fit those together. Recipes work the same way in testing. We want to be able to justify what we're working on. And more to the point, we're only using the tools that are really important for us. And if we know that they are, we set those aside as a building block because we know we're going to call on it. So rather than write out a big, long, lengthy test procedure, link together your recipes you know you have. And then when you get to the part where you have something unique and interesting, okay, now you can start doing some experimentation. And if you need to write out some documentation for your test case, go ahead and do so. Again, what's the benefits of having these type of recipes? You get efficiency because you've already written out the documentation for this. And in some cases, it can be huge. I said between 25% and 0.05% of a traditional test case approach. And what that means is that in some cases, you might get a little benefit from writing these recipes out. And in some cases, you might get a tremendous amount of benefit because it does a lot of your setup for you. And again, they're reusable. They're snippets that we can take advantage of and we can put into places we need to. And if we don't need to, we don't have to worry about them. And they can be adapted and they can be modified as needed. And another benefit to this is that we allow for stopping information overload. We don't have to keep repeating ourselves. We can address certain concerns. We can also use recipes to augment automation. In fact, if you have a recipe and you know for a fact that it's something you're going to have to do all the time, that's a brilliant place to be automating. In fact, I'd argue it's probably the most important place to automate because you know those are the steps you're going to have to run. Steps that are a little more squishy might be harder to automate, or you may not even need to automate them at all. So again, by having these snippets, by having them put in place, and by referencing them, you already have the documentation you need, and you're going to be able to put together your testing strategy a lot faster. Second, let's take a look at defects. What are they, and how do we have to, when we deal with them, what are we actually talking about? Defects tell us quite a bit because they tell us where our problem areas are. It's beyond just, hey, we need to fix this stuff. Really, what we want to do is we want to look to see what is the status of our software and how can we improve it overall. Where there's a bug in one place, chances are there are bugs in multiple places. And if you start looking at them, you can start to find patterns of behavior. And by gathering those patterns, you can get insights and say, what is an area that we're having trouble with? Why do we have all these bugs? Is it possible that you are relying on a third-party application and that third-party application has just gotten upgraded and suddenly you've got a lot of bugs? Is the bugs your problem or is it their problem? Well, if you're relying on a piece of software, it is ultimately your problem, but it's an external issue. You still have to address it. You still have to work with it. But by doing so, you're able to then focus to see if by changing those details and modifying how you're interacting, do your bugs go away or do they get handled in a very different way? That's something that needs to be considered. And again, if you get repetitive bugs, chances are you're going to start to see there are areas that you probably need to address. There are probably modules that have some issues. And there's this concept of a heat map that we use. When you're starting to look at defects and you have a heat map and you see where are the hot spots, where are we getting bugs, what modules are you working with? What classes are you working with? What part of the code base are you in? It's a good bet that if you have a heat map showing you where things are happening, you can find problems, not just in the class you're working with, but probably classes that are interacting with it as well. Now, we have this phrase called the pesticide paradox. And the idea is that when you spray for bugs in a garden and you keep spraying, on one level, you're going to get less bugs. True. But the other problem is that if there's areas you don't hit, and if there's areas that only get a minimal amount of pesticide treatment, the problem you're going to run into is that you're not just going to get bugs that recur in the literal sense of nature, you're going to get bugs that are going to start to become immune to the pesticide. So realize that just because you've been over an area a lot and you've covered a lot of ground, your issue with pesticide is the sense that you think you've knocked out all the bugs. You absolutely haven't. But you do need to know that you can look and see how you can start adapting to those. And here's where optimizing your bug list and you start to present your techniques in a sorted list. Like you have your defect number, your title, priority, and all that, and you figure out how to prioritize them. Oftentimes, you might find that, yes, you have one major crash, that's critical, but you might also discover that you have a lot of smaller bugs that are user interface and usability related, to the point to where if you have multiple bugs that are usability related, that should give you pause. And you should think to yourself, what are we doing here? And how can we address this? Maybe we need to take a step back and think along the lines of the user experience entirely. Let's move into test coverage. Test coverage is a difficult area. And in the book, we talk about this idea that you can say, is testing finished? Yes, no, maybe. What does finished actually mean? And what you realize is that with the exception of very trivial programs, you're never finished testing. You're always going to be interacting with something in the testing cycle. That's why we call it the infinite challenge of testing. There is just an infinite possibility. It's also why we typically say we want to be able to communicate to people how much coverage we've provided. In other words, what is the model we're going to use to explain that? Now, again, models are all flawed. They're all imperfect, but they can be useful and they can help guide our efforts and communicate. So one of the things that we have recommended often is we would say we have a matrix and we have our features and we can give it a coverage score. So 0 means we haven't touched it at all. Nothing's been done on it. And 10 means we have thoroughly tested it. And I'm putting thoroughly in air quotes there. Honestly, in the real world, you can't get a 10 because there's no human way you can hit every conceivable possible exhaustive option in your testing. However, having said that, We oftentimes will include up to a 9 for we've given as much exploration as we can under the circumstances that we have in the time limits we're allowed with the details we've been given. And for most product owners and project managers and decision makers, they're going to look at you and go, you know what? That's close enough to a 10 for me. And you can run with it. But the point is, you're communicating it. And this table that we have here is just a quick, simple example to show how you can have a feature in something, what your coverage listing is, and how you've done with it. So also something else that and we're going to talk about this more as we get through later on in this talk, is what we call a dashboard. And you can make some very low tech dashboards. They can literally be on a whiteboard written in green, yellow, or red ink to communicate what you want to, or they can be a spreadsheet, or they can be a web page that's gathering metrics and displaying it on an always on monitor that's mounted to the wall. The point is, the information radiator is telling people, excuse me, the information radiator is telling people the status of what you're doing, how much has been covered, how well that is going, and what still needs to be done. Okay. So this is a quick example of how to do that. And again, this doesn't relate to any given company. We've anonymized it, but this is a quick example of how you can go about making a very low-tech dashboard that's very good at communicating information. Now, the point is that these allow you to have conversations. Okay. You can, instead of giving vague, we're doing okay, having this dashboard and having this screen, this information radiator, can give a very clear and concise explanation of where you're at. If it's starting to fill up with color, you know you've covered stuff. If you see a lot of green, that means you've got a lot of good coverage and things are going well. If you see a little bit of yellow in there, all right, there's some questions. We can come back and look at those. If you start to see a small dabbling of red, okay, we've got some problems. If you start to see a big swath of red, major problems. But the beauty of this is that now you can have those conversations and you can show what you've done, where the problems are, and anybody walking up can look at the board or the information radiator on the monitor and say, yeah, okay, we know what we need to look at. And what this also helps us do is this helps us transform risk management into our testing itself. So very often when we talk about risk, it's a high level hand wavy thing. Oh yeah, there's some things here. We can do better about that and we can have a better conversation. So what we want to do is we want to say, instead of looking at the software testing, yes, we've done all that we can do. Yes, we've tested it. Yes, everything works. We can get in and say, what are the dangers of this product? And can we talk about them? In fact, I would encourage talking about the dangers of your product very early in the cycle. You should be having these conversations at your story workshops or at your first Three Amigos meeting, or when a proposal for a release is going to happen. If you as a software tester are in that meeting, and if you're not, I would strongly suggest you ask to be in it, start provoking the requirements. That's a phrase from John Bach, so I want to give him due credit for that. But provoking requirements means you're asking questions and you're assessing what is the risk for this new feature? What are the areas that we need to cover? If we don't do this well, if we don't address this early, what problems are we going to face later on down the road? And so this helps us get an idea as to what those risks are and how to address them. And then we can prioritize our testing efforts for maximum impact. And if anybody who's worked on a Kanban board, or again, using our low-tech dashboard, we can modify it. We can say, here's our whole to-do list, here's our in process, and here's what we finished. And we can prioritize and say, these are the things that really matter, or they matter right now. What matters today and what matters tomorrow could be two totally different things. But the idea is lower impact issues, we can push those down. Higher impact issues like database integrity, security, vulnerabilities, et cetera, we want to make sure that we focus our priorities there. And that will allow us to start to rank what these are. The higher the risk, probably the earlier and the more focus of testing we want to give. The lower the risk, we might be able to give it a lower number and we might be able to delay a little bit on it. Not completely, but you are going to be able to say one of these things has to be done before the other one does. And I would argue the one with the greater risk should go first. Okay, we also have limited time. And so no matter what we do, we can create a cut line. And that will tell us what's achievable, what can we do in this given amount of time with these resources and this number of tests and this amount of code so that we can hit whatever window we have. And if we know what that is, we can communicate that. Now, they might disagree with us, they being powers that be that oversee testing. They may say, I really wish you could give me double of what you're offering in half the time. And there might be some ways to do that. If you're willing to accept the risk, we could probably cover more areas. We could probably give you more details, or we could probably cover this stuff more quickly, but it will come at cost, and that cost will be increased risk. Are you willing to accept that? And if senior management says they're willing to accept that, all right, run with it. You've told them, you've given them the information. And so this helps a lot in regards to giving them that ability to make those decisions. And if you've got a limited amount of time, best way to do it is just dynamically prioritize and help them so they can adapt to what they need to do through being informed, basically. Okay, so one of the things we want to talk about with our testing strategy, I want to give credit to Karen Johnson. She's the one who coined the mnemonic RC. Say that 10 times fast. But this is a way to think about if you want to put together your risk strategy, you want to put together your priorities for what you want to cover. This is how you can do it. And this is a good mnemonic to help you do it. All right, recent. In other words, you've got newly added features and code changes. That's a pretty good candidate for it needs to be tested now. Core, it's an essential functionality that's critical for your app's operation. Risk, is this a risky area? If you don't do well on this, is that going to be a problem and look bad for you if it goes out with an issue? Configuration sensitive. Do you have specific environments? Are you dealing with a third-party product? That's also going to be something you have to look at. And if that third-party product has to be set up in a certain way, you also have to be aware of that, and you have to make sure that you are taking that into account. Any areas where you've done bug fixes, repaired, how have they been implemented, and can those introduce new issues? And then what are some chronic areas? What are problem areas, problem children that you're always dealing with? Those should be put up front too. So there you go. That's a strategy for so this is introducing RC, and a little bit more on that. And Karen, thank you so much for giving this to us. This is brilliant. Now, let's look at ways that we can use RC in real life, okay? So let's say you have a 2-day regression and you can only get to do it in a morning because it's urgent, it's got to go out. I know we usually give you 2 days. We don't have 2 days. We have until noon today from the time you get into the office, go. What do? Well, here's a great example. Use RC to figure out what are the areas that really matter. Put them on sticky notes and put them on a board. Make a immediate Kanban board and say, we're going to deal with this, and this. And make your notes on the stickies, go through, run your tests. And if they look good, move them over to the done. Move them over. And when you're finished, okay, you've made a good faith effort at covering as much as you can with the materials you have, but you've prioritized them based on that reality, okay? So this allows you the ability to prioritize and execute based on a changing world, and you're able to adapt to it. And again, this is just reiterating on what I've already said. This allows you a chance to plan. It allows you a chance to really tailor what you need to do for an immediate need. And it goes well beyond regression testing. You can even use this in your active new tests that you do. You can prioritize them, you can put them in a certain order, and you can give them the attention that they need right up front. And you can always look back to this as, am I covering the right things? And the final thing, you saw us talking about a low-tech dashboard, and there are other ways that you can go about this. And so what you see here, this is for visualization purposes, but this is an example of what we could do to make a more high-end dashboard, if you will, that could be our information radiator. And we call this our puzzle pieces assembled. We could make a part of our dashboard show our coverage. We could demonstrate the recipes that we're using for doing the testing we do. We can demonstrate our census of risk. We can show where our heat map is, what our coverage is, and we can look at how many builds we've got rolling at a given time. So this will, and give this color so that you can see what's going on here. This can give a lot of information in a small area. It's skimmable. It's something you can look at rapidly, and it can give you a great deal of information. And you can also build in other artifacts. You can take your CI runs from Jenkins, or if you've got test failures in your test case system, you can export those out. You can make it so that you're taking Excel tables and feeding it. And again, it's a way to be able to communicate this to everybody on your team. And so by giving that example, you're taking your recent changes, your defect filings, and now you're able to have that "are we done yet" conversation, much less of, yeah, kind of, well, we've covered as much as we can think of. Are we done yet? What does the dashboard say? Go take a look there. If that dashboard is all green, all covered, and there's no heat, and the builds have been up and pumped and ready to do their thing, there you go. There's your answer. If you see blank spaces, or if you see not a lot of information filled in, you can tell pretty quickly whether or not you're done, or even trying, or how much you've got to go. All right, so to put this all together, you have your recipes. Those give you methodologies for testing complex, non-intuitive functionalities. They allow you to build and piece together what you need to. Documentation is kept just to what's necessary for those modules, for those recipes, and you can combine recipes as you need and work with what you have to get you to the point to where you can do some active testing. Coverage gives you comprehensive perspective on your testing scope, what are well-tested areas and what areas you haven't really covered. Defects, those are important. You want to look to see what you're getting and where those areas of issue are. More to the point, can you pinpoint where the areas are happening, and do you see heat in those areas? One issue might be a one-off, but it might also be an indication of a deeper problem. Schedule. How are you going to go about doing the testing you need to do? How do you put a rhythm to your testing activities? How do you make sure that you're communicating to your group how long it's taking you to do what you need to do and what steps have to be done to allow you to say that you're done? What is your test strategy and how are you evolving it? I would say use RC, RC, RC as a great methodology for helping you devise what should come first, what should come next, what's high priority, what's low priority, and adapt it as needed. And then communication through dashboards. Your dashboard is the eyes and ears and nose of your project, if you will. It allows you to see, are you on the path you expect to be? Are there bumps in the road? Have you identified what those bumps are? What can you do with them? Again, the key piece to a dashboard is communication. And as long as you are communicating what's going on, you're going to be in a pretty good place. And with that, I didn't want to say that this was a sales pitch because it's not really. You can use the information we've given you here, and we encourage you to do that. But if this piqued your interest and you think of what we've been talking about here is something exciting, and oh yes, please tell me more, well, go get the book. And that's Software Testing Strategies as written by Matthew Heuser and Michael Larsen. This was published by Pact Publishing back in December of 2023, just last month. And right now we have a discount code. You can get the book for 25% off. If you go to Pact Publishing site directly, I'll keep this on the screen so that you can look at the short URL that we have created. You can go there, enter in that code, get 25% off, and that code is good until February 17th, 2024. And with that, I want to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. And again, depending upon how this goes, if you are seeing this video, again, my apologies for not being there in person, but I hope you found this useful and I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I would love to come back and talk to you again sometime. If this chapter interested you and you thought that it might be good to talk a little bit more about contents of the book, well, we have 15 more that we can discuss. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.